It's in there in the Constitution. Trump cannot do it. If he breaks the law, I mean, that's if he were to actually do this, it would be, I mean, it's impeachment worthy right away. I mean, the country wouldn't be a democracy anymore if Donald Trump were to do that.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Robert Kelly on the show. He's a professor of political science at Pusan National University. He's walked us through this decision from Democrats to sue the Trump administration over Trump's decision for signing an executive order to overhaul US federal elections by requiring voters to bring proof of citizenship. So what that would mean for lower income households who don't actually have passports. We've spoken to him also about these comments from Trump saying he's pissed off with Putin and where that relationship lies. We've also spoken to him about the longevity of Elon Musk's role in the White House. How long is he staying? Because his stocks for Tesla are falling, so he might need to get back to a home base there. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube. Robert Kelly, Professor of Political Science at Pusan National University. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
I thank you for having me again.
We've got to dive straight into this update from the Democrats and Trump. Democrats have sued the Trump administration over his executive order to overhaul US federal elections by requiring voters to bring proof of citizenship and limiting when states receive their mail-in ballots. Now, Trump's reasoning, Bob, was election fraud. You've heard the term. We're going to end it,
Right.
Hopefully. At least this will go a long way towards ending it. This, of course, prompted legal action from the Campaign Legal Center and the State Democracy Defenders Fund. They first filed a lawsuit, and then the Democratic Governors Association, along with Senate and House Democrat leaders, filed a complaint. They stated the president's executive order is an unlawful action that threatens to uproot our tried and tested election systems and silence potentially millions of Americans. Bob, what was your reaction to this news? Did it make sense, or was it just another attempt for Republicans to claim that the voting situation is rigged?
I think it's about 50% of the latter. The Republican Party has emphasized a lot the idea of election security in the last 15 years or so. There's been a lot of suspicion in the United States that a lot of this is aimed at voter suppression, reducing turnout, in part because of the perception that people who don't have ID are more likely to vote for Democrats. Now, there's actually not a lot of empirical research in political science to support that assertion. It's not actually clear that voter suppression efforts, removing voters from the rolls, actually enhances the turnout of Republicans rather than Democrats, in the same way that it's not actually clear that encouraging people to vote in person on election day actually returns more Republican votes than Democratic votes. I think if you actually sort of look at the writing on this, the scholarship on it, it's not actually clear all this is necessary. But whatever, the Republicans have been pushing this for a while now. It is true that voting ID rules are all over the place in the United States. That is a reflection really of two things. One, the fact that the U.S. doesn't have a national identity card. This is something that makes the United States very different than most democracies. You don't actually have like a little ID with a national identity number on it like most countries do. And also because voting rules and voting systems are state-led, right? That's one of the things the U.S. Constitution gives to the states. And so there is very thin federal rules on elections, right? There's some, but they're really not terribly enforced, and there's not a big agency for that, right? It really is done by the states, and so that gives you room for the states to have different election processes, and I think that's what the executive order is targeting.
But it kind of will act as, I don't want to say prejudice, Bob, but not every American has a passport,
Right.
as you said. Americans don't have this national voting card, so they're relying on a
Right.
passport to prove their citizenship in the United States. But a lot of lower income, middle class
Right.
Americans don't have a passport. A lot of Americans haven't been overseas. And Donald
Right.
Trump has spent a majority of these years campaigning for this group of Americans to vote alongside him and that he will do better by them. So I just feel like, is this not alienating that group of people that have brought him in?
Yeah, like I said, I mean the literature on this, the actual political science scholarship on this, I'm not an expert in that, but I mean I've read some of it, is actually pretty mixed on this. It's not actually clear that this is going to enhance Donald Trump's coalition, right? I mean, if you actually go back and you look at the way the president behaved in the run-up to the 2024 election, he actually began to pull back from this insistence that everybody vote on election day because he began to realize that discouraging mail-in votes was actually hurting him as well in different states. So again, I think that the impacts are something of a wash, right? But as you said, I mean, the what happens in practice, I suppose, is kind of a class impact, which is to say that people who take the time to get, and this is going to be people who have more money, more free time, more education, people who take the time to get a driver's license and a passport are going to be ones are the ones that are going to have these kinds of identity documents. But if you don't drive, if you're older, for example, and you think driving is very difficult, right? If you don't know where the DMV is, you don't have someone to take you to the DMV, if you're disabled or something like that, if you don't travel and have a passport, it's not clear what document you would use. There are state identity documents, but a lot of people don't have. You can't actually get like an ID from your state that says I am, person XYZ. But a lot of people don't have that either. And again, none of this is required, right? And so it raises the issues of disenfranchisement that you're bringing up. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. It will be interesting to see if that even gets passed. But of course, Democrats are not happy with him. But moving on to one of the big stories in the international space this week, Bob, was of course Donald Trump in a phone conversation with NBC a few days ago. He said he was pissed off and angry with Vladimir Putin for floating the idea that Ukraine needs an interim administration and for attacking Zelensky's credibility, because it kind of meant Trump's kind of takeaway from that was that Putin really wasn't working towards ending the war. But then he followed up with reporters on Air Force One saying he still thinks Putin isn't going back on his word. He said, I've known him for a long time. What was your response to this? Do you feel like Trump might be in denial here?
Yeah, I mean, if you actually look at the behavior of the Russians during the war, there's in the last couple weeks, right, in the last few months since Donald Trump has been talking to them, the Russian campaign doesn't really seem to be changing or slackening or improving in any way, right? I mean, they're still striking energy targets with drones. They're still hitting civilian buildings, right? The conflict on the front line goes on. The Russians are making slow progress, and it's really horrible, right? It's kind of turning into a World War One style stalemate, right, of enormous losses for very small gains. But I mean, the Russians are still prosecuting the conflict, and Vladimir Putin and no one else in the Russian elite has come forward to suggest that Russia's war goals are any different. It still seems like, and we don't know, right? But it still seems like the Russian intention is to at least drive to split the country in half, to take the capital, right, to depose Zelensky. It's not clear that the Russians have given up on any of the things that they initially suggested, right? Their initial war goals. And until Putin says that, until Putin is willing to say, we'll allow Ukraine to continue as a sovereign state or to have elections or we won't dismember the entire country, until he actually says some of this, it's really kind of hard to believe that any kind of ceasefire wouldn't just be a pause, which would allow the Russians to rearm. And I think that's really what the big European pushback on this has been. I think this is what the Ukrainians are afraid of, the Brits, the French. I think everybody's concerned that this ceasefire is going to be bogus and the Russians are going to come back to the war in 6 months, having had a breather.
Yeah,
Right?
because
And I think Trump is kind of beginning to get up to speed on this. But, like you said, I mean, he trusts Vladimir Putin a lot, which is, kind of naive, I think. But yeah, I think that's where the debate is now.
it kind of feels like, because it feels like we've been on a standstill in terms of what information the Trump administration, including Steve Witkoff, have fed to the media, because right now it feels like we've had a few days without any kind of chat about negotiation. And
Right.
my interpretation is that Vladimir Putin is, I guess, buying time as he directs his army to make as many advances as he could. I spoke to a veteran, a former British colonel yesterday, who has intel that Russian troops are using illegal chemical weapons on
Really?
on Ukrainian troops.
Wow.
And so it doesn't seem, Bob, it doesn't seem as if
Right.
Putin has any intention of slowing down. As you said, he's gone back against his word about this 30-day ceasefire on energy and infrastructure facilities. So it feels like he's just basically peddling and buying time until he makes so many more advances that he feels like he is going to win the war.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, I suppose the Viet Cong did this sort of, if you will, during the U.S. negotiations to try to end the Vietnam War. Right? The Viet Cong would try to sort of make, and the North Vietnamese try to make sort of improvements on the ground in order to improve their bargaining position. And if Vladimir Putin really thinks that bargaining between the U.S. and Russia is coming up to end the conflict, right? The more he can improve his position on the ground, the better, the stronger his position is in the negotiations. I imagine that's what he's probably trying to do. And I think it's something of a shock how the Trump administration doesn't seem to grasp this, right? That we're all kind of waiting for Donald Trump to realize that Putin lies a great deal, that Putin hasn't changed his war goals, right? And so here we are kind of waiting to see if Trump can actually put some real pressure on the Russians. But, the president just has been not willing to do that, right? We're 10 weeks into the second Trump administration, and there's been no real meaningful American pressure on Russia yet. It's not really, and we're pressuring the Ukrainians, right? But we're not really pressuring the Russians to come to the table. And so if you're Putin, why would you stop the
Yeah,
conflict?
absolutely. They've had to make no public concessions. But
That's right.
this kind of language in the last few days, when he's speaking about Putin saying those pissed off and angry comments, it does mark some sort of a change in Trump's
Hopefully.
rhetoric, backing Zelensky after originally calling him a dictator and placing blame
Right.
on the war on him. But do you think there's a chance, on that note, that Trump will flip gears and start placing this pressure on Putin by placing these further sanctions that he said he would on countries buying Russian oil?
Yeah, I think it's there. I think to be fair to the president, I think he genuinely wants a solution to this. Part of that may be ego. I think Donald Trump really would like a Nobel Peace Prize, right? I think that he wanted to get one back when he was talking to the North Koreans in 2018, 2019. I think he's kind of hoping he can get something like that here, right? And if Trump can actually get the Russians to stop the war, that would actually be pretty fantastic. And he says all the time he has this great relationship with Putin. Here's the chance for him to use that to actually get something really important, which would be to stop the conflict. The important thing is that stopping the conflict, though, not just be surrender, right? If it just looks like the Ukrainians have to give up a third of their territory or a lot of their mineral rights to us or to the Russians or something like that, they're not going to stop, right? Trump has got to not only talk to Putin and get him to make some concessions, dial down the war goals would be the most obvious one. Say,
Yeah.
the
Leave
Russians are going to
Ukraine.
stop where they are and they're not going to drive on Kiev, right? Yeah, and that I think is the real issue, right? If you can get Putin to sort of step back a little bit, then you can probably get the Ukrainians to be willing to make some concessions too. But again, as you mentioned, so far it looks like Trump hasn't really gotten a whole lot out of the Russians, right? And until he does, if you're the Ukrainians, you're not going to agree to a deal, right? And why would you agree to a deal that gives away like 20% of your country, gives away your mineral rights to the Americans, and you get nothing?
Yeah, you
And
don't
they're not
get
going to
you
agree
don't
to it.
get
The war is going to grind on unless the two sides both accept the terms. And I think the Trump administration has really missed this. They keep trying to force terms on the Ukrainians, but they're not actually getting anything out of the Russians. And so the Ukrainians are never going to accept the deal, right? The
yeah.
war will just go on unless the two parties agree to end it.
Especially because over the weekend, Trump said that there would be big problems if Zelensky doesn't sign this rare earth mineral deal. He's still pushing for NATO membership. He's still pushing for the security guarantees that they won't be left in the dust at the end of the war. And it's a pretty fair request to ask for, especially when Putin is asking for him to get the opposite. They don't want Zelensky to get NATO. They don't want Ukraine to have protection. But over the weekend, Bob, Trump and Finnish President Alexander Stubb, they had a golf match at Mar-a-Lago where he revealed after that he thought that Trump was growing frustrated with Putin. He said there was a combination of impatience and a tad of frustration. We were talking a lot about the ceasefire and the frustrations he had that Russia was not committing to it. So, and then he said, as Putin continues to refuse this 30-day ceasefire, he said, if there was a pendulum of trust and distrust, certainly Russian activity in the past few weeks has proven that we're moving more towards the distrust side of things. So is there a sense that Donald Trump will come out of this situation? He'll come out without a resolution. He'll grow so frustrated. He'll pull the US out of all involvement in brokering negotiations, even withdraw the US from NATO.
Yeah, I think the president is slowly grasping what President Biden and President Obama grasped before him, right? Which is that Vladimir Putin is really not a trustworthy counterparty, and that when Putin says he'll sort of do X, Y, Z, he often doesn't follow through on this, right? I mean, this is sort of classic autocratic behavior. I think Donald Trump has given Vladimir Putin much more room to misbehave than previous U.S. presidents have. In part, that's, I think, because the president has a kind of an admiration for Vladimir Putin. But in a weird kind of way, this actually sort of works in the United States' favor, which is to say that if Vladimir Putin won't broker a deal with Donald Trump, that means he won't broker a deal with anybody. Because Vladimir Putin is going to get a better deal out of Donald Trump than he ever would have gotten out of Biden. And so if Putin won't come to the table at some point in the next 6 months to make some kind of deal to end the conflict where his war goals are dialed back and he accepts 20% of Ukraine instead of all of it or something along those lines, if Putin won't come to the table for that, then we know that Putin's goals in Ukraine are essentially unlimited. That he basically wants to wipe out the entire state. He wants to march all the way to the border with Poland, right? And that's important information. Then we know that Putin is really an unbridled imperialist, and NATO has got to really start to arm. And then I think the big question is, how does Donald Trump respond to that? Because we do know that Donald Trump doesn't like NATO. We also know that Donald Trump really admires Vladimir Putin. And if Vladimir Putin really disappoints him, as this material coming from the Finns indicates, it's just not clear how Trump will respond, because Trump has said for a decade now how much he likes Vladimir Putin, right? And so if Trump has this big falling out with him, who knows how Trump will respond. But my guess is it will be good for the Ukrainians in some way or another, right? If Trump finally breaks this weird bromance or whatever he has with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, you almost need Putin to completely turn on him and publicly shame Donald Trump for Donald Trump to realize that they're not friends. But moving into more domestic issues, Bob, Trump says he's not joking about the possibility of serving a third term as president,
Oh my
which is
God.
obviously beyond the limit set by the US Constitution. He said there are methods by which you could do it. When asked if JD Vance, the vice president, could run for office and then hand him the role instead, he said that's one method, but there are others too. He said it's far too early to think about this, how he might remain in the White House after 4 years, but a lot of people want me to do it, but I basically tell them we have a long way to go. So what was your reaction to this? We knew he was probably thinking about it, but he's finally kind of answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, this is wildly illegal. It's unconstitutional. It's black letter law, right? I mean, you can't run for a third term, and you can't do this weird passing off thing. I mean, I guess the idea is Trump would run for president, or no, Vance would run for president, and Trump would be the vice president, and then like Vance would like resign on day 6 or something, and Trump would take over. First of all, it's illegal, right? It violates the Constitution. Also, second of all, why would Vance do that, right? And Vance gets elected president. Like, why would he sort of turn over the presidency to Donald Trump? I would also point out that Donald Trump right now, you think he's like 79?
Yeah.
Right? You know, if Donald Trump were to run for a second term, he'd be what, 82, 83?
He'd be Biden.
Yeah, right. And so it's Biden all over again, right? I mean, he'd be senile or whatever, right? I mean, so if Trump actually got a third term, I mean, Trump would finish his presidency, what, he'd be like 87 or 88?
He would literally be Joe Biden if he'd won a second term.
Yeah, it would, right? And so, no, I mean, it's wildly illegal. And again, this is something of a stress test, I suppose, for the Republicans in Congress, right? For sort of Trump's coalition, right? At some point, are they ever going to step forward and say, look, the president has gone too far? I mean, this has been a regular issue in how we respond to Trump's MAGA movement, Make America Great movement, right? Is there any limit on presidential power? Is there anything that Donald Trump can't do? Right? He famously said I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and get reelected. Well, that's actually pretty terrifying, right? That, and so this is one of these sort of big red lines, right? Does Trump respect the Constitution? I mean, it's right there in their Constitution to prevent anything like what the reason this came about was because of Franklin Delano Roosevelt running for president 4 times. So it was codified after he died, right? It's in there in the Constitution. Trump cannot do it. If he breaks the law, I mean, if he were to actually do this, it would be, I mean, it's impeachment worthy right away. I mean, the country wouldn't be a democracy anymore if Donald Trump were to do that. So when he says he's not joking, I mean, I'm not quite sure what to make out of that. I mean, it sounds an awful like autocracy. It sounds like authoritarianism.
But also, Bob, didn't you learn anything from the Democratic Party? Didn't you learn anything from their failure in 2024 that you need to be grooming the next generation of leaders? You need to be bringing the next person up. Otherwise, you're going to be in this same situation that the Democrats were in when they realized that Biden was too old and too senile to be running for another 4 years, and they only had a few months to be putting Kamala Harris up in that position, who was wildly disliked, did a great job campaigning to get to where she was, but not enough that she could beat Donald Trump.
Yeah, I'm sort of more like a never Trump sort of alienated conservative than I am a progressive, right? And I used to actually work for the Republican Party back in Ohio, in the U.S. a long time ago. So I'm less familiar with the progressive side of this debate. But from my understanding of sort of my friends in that space, there is a big debate inside the Democratic Party arguing that Democratic Party elites are too old, right? Sort of that's like gerontocracy, that a lot of Democratic senators and Congress people are in their 70s, even in their 80s and stuff like that, that the party needs new blood. Barack Obama was kind of supposed to put that together, but it didn't really come together, right? There was sort of a social movement around Barack Obama. He was kind of like this rock star, but it never really kind of congealed, right? And the successors to Obama were both sort of older Democrats who had their heyday back in the 1990s, that is to say Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. And Kamala Harris kind of had that. She had some of that sort of Obama vibe. She was young, she was fun, she used to like laugh on TV. It was kind of great. But she only had like 4. No, I actually think she actually struck me as quite personable.
Right? I did as well, yeah.
She seemed very pleasant. I mean, all the women I knew, all the professional women I knew, my mother, my wife, and so on, they all kind of liked her. She seemed like fun and whatever. But she only had, like you said, she only had 4 months.
Yeah.
She didn't have enough time to put it together, right? she probably should have been a senator a little bit longer, or, a
Mm.
vice president a little bit longer. I think there's kind of a consensus that she probably got into the presidential race too early. But I think this is a known problem on the American left, that the party is governed by people who need to step aside, and you need younger
Mm.
voices. And Harris, could have been one of those, but maybe jumped in too early. It's
Yeah,
sort of a shame.
and Donald Trump, he'll need to know when to quit. But just a final question for you, Bob. We don't have
Yeah.
much time, but Donald Trump made these kind of bizarre remarks about Elon Musk working for the White House. He said, "I think he's amazing, but I also think he's got a big company to run, and so at some point he's going to be going back. He wants to. I'd keep him as long as I could keep him." Now, according to Politico, Musk is classed as a temporary government employee, which means he has a 130-day cap on his services at the White House. Which mean that would kind of take him to the end of May. But a White House
Right.
official told Politico in February that there was no end in sight for him working alongside Trump. So do you think it's time for Elon Musk to kind of go back to tech, or do you think he'll get bored of government work?
Well, I think if you look at the stock price of Tesla, I think this is actually becoming a really serious issue for Elon Musk, right? I mean, it's pretty clear now that Elon Musk's his tight association with Donald Trump, has turned off a lot of the people who would normally consider electronic vehicles, right? Electronic vehicles are the kind of thing in the United States that more progressive-minded voters who are environmentally conscious would like to buy. Elon Musk has now aligned himself with a president who's very much opposed to those progressive values. And I think Tesla stock has really shown that slippage, right? I mean, you now have people on the left in the US openly cheering for Tesla stock to decline as a way to punish Elon Musk. And so I would imagine that those kinds of business pressures are eventually going to push Musk to go back to the private sector, because my understanding of his finances are that a lot of it's tied up in Tesla. I also think there's sort of a general exhaustion with Elon Musk. It's not clear what his role is. It's not clear the constitutionality of many of the choices that he's making. It's not clear if he has the right to go into a lot of these semi-autonomous agencies in the U.S. government, like the NOAA, the weather organization, the what is it? National Oceanographic and
Mm.
Aerospace Associated Administration, I think, right, and the U.S. Institute of Peace, right. You have sort of all these kind of like semi-independent agencies where Musk has been going in and sort of creating all kinds of changes, and it's just not clear if Musk has the constitutional authority to do that, because we've never had a kind of co-president like this before, right? And so the longer Musk is hanging around, the more these constitutional issues sort of grow and grow and grow. At some point, this is going to wind up in front of the Supreme Court if Musk doesn't step aside. And I think that's kind of what they're laying the groundwork for, is for Musk to eventually to exit.
And it actually feels like he's literally stopping time with the amount of work he's doing on so many businesses and now the White House. So I guess we'll have to be watching that, Bob. So Robert Kelly, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you again for having me.